Good day. Welcome to another session on our Entrepreneurship Master Program. Today we're looking at access to funding. And this lesson that we're looking at today is our part of our case study lesson, where we're looking at different case studies so that we give you a practical scenario where entrepreneurs have implemented this, or they have practice some of the principles that we are trying to teach you from this program, from this module. So our case studies, we have 3 case studies that we are using in this program. Throughout the program, we're using these 3 case studies. One is McDonald's. So we're looking at how Ray Kroc built McDonald's, and we're looking at the Oakland A's, and we're looking at from Moneyball, the book Moneyball or the movie Moneyball. So we're looking at how Billy turned around the Oakland A's, and we look at AEY, which is the movie War Dogs. It shows it's based on true story where young entrepreneurs have built a massive tenderpreneur business where they secured large contracts from the US Defense Department. So these are the 3 case studies that we're going to go through today. This lesson or this video is about the 3 case studies. And just maybe to give you background on access to funding. So we looked at the access to funding from the perspective of accessing grants or incentives from different government institutions. These are grants that a business or a government give to businesses so that they can pursue maybe a specific agenda or a specific developmental goal. So what government will do will will provide incentives or grants so that it encourages different industries to behave in a certain way, to behave in a good way. So they use call it grants and incentives. So those are the grants and incentives are the mechanisms that a government will use to influence behavior from the industry. Let's say they want industry maybe to develop rural areas, or to develop youth, or to develop certain industries, or to create access for entrepreneurs in a certain space, or to remove maybe barriers to entry. Then to do that, government will develop grants or incentives that they will give to entrepreneurs to enter an industry or to behave in a certain way, maybe to employ maybe women, or to set up enterprises in rural areas, or to develop certain sectors. Like, I don't know, you want to, maybe the recent one, which was a big one, is where DTI wanted to introduce or to increase black people's participation in manufacturing sectors. So they call it Black Industrialist, where they were giving black people massive grants or incentives for them to participate, where it was a 50-50 funding, where they asked entrepreneurs to go secure 50% of the funding, and DTI will give them 50% as a grant. And that's a blended funding, and it's funding that is used to encourage, in this case, to encourage black industrialists, they call it, to enter into the manufacturing market. So those are the grants. It's just an example of accessing grant funding. And we looked at bootstrapping. That is when an entrepreneur is funding a business from their own pockets. So you're not going out to get third party to fund your business. You use the resources or the funding that you have to start or to expand your business. It's called bootstrapping. So it might be that an entrepreneur will take their savings and use it to start the business, or take maybe their savings to grow the business, or use the internal resources. Remember, as business operates, it makes profit, and then you take that money, you use it, you reinvest it in the business. That is called bootstrapping. You are using your own resources without going outside. That's the second type of funding that we looked at. And then the third one was angel investing. That one is when you go out, there are high net worth individuals out there who are investing in small businesses or potential businesses. These people they've made their own money wherever. Maybe they were into big executives somewhere, or they were running successful companies, and as a way of giving back and investing in emerging businesses, then they set up, they don't necessarily set up a fund, but they just open themselves up to say, no, I'm willing to fund businesses in this space. And then they fund it, and most of the time is they take equity in the business. And most of the businesses that they focus on are those with high growth, in high growth sectors, like you're in IT, maybe sectors that have potential to have exponential growth. So that's how the angel investing invest in certain sectors. So they choose their sector, they're using their own money. So now entrepreneurs, they can access the angel investors through networks and making investigation and looking at different angel investing organizations, and then participate in there and pitch to those angel investors. So that is the third one. And then the fourth one was, we looked at commercial funding. This one now is when entrepreneurs approach banks or developmental institutions or any other commercial funder, private commercial funder out there for funding. So that you have a formal loan agreement, you have terms where you're paying it over a period of time, and averagely a loan or a business loan is like about 5 years. Again, it depends. I mean, if you want funding for working capital, it can be less than that, because working capital is like your stock, your debtors, and your creditors, whatever. Then you can fund it over maybe over 3 years, or maybe you might look for a bridging facility where you just want to execute an order. That it can be a 3 months, 4 months, 6 months type of a loan, where you have to repay it within that period of time, and you get long-term loans, which are to buy equipment and things like that. And that average is 5 years. But if you are building and it involves long-term assets, then you can maybe extend it to, depending on the cash flow of the business. So it can go to 8 years and some even 15 years if it's a huge property development. So depending on the type of funding you're looking for. A commercial funding you enter into, if approved, because you apply, they come into what they call due diligence, investigate your business to see if what you've presented, the facts are true and the risk is acceptable. And if they find that they are happy with the risks that they have identified, they can be mitigated, or they're not high, or they can tolerate them, then they invest in the business. They give you the loan, and you have to repay back the loan over time. So when you're talking access to funding in this course, we're talking about it in this context, that we're looking at this for funding mechanism that entrepreneurs can access. All right. So I'm just giving you the background on access to funding before we get into our case study, so that you have a clear background on what is access to funding and what are we trying to address when we want to with this module. And if you're still not clear on what access to funding is, you can go back and we have the material and video session on each funding mechanism that we just mentioned. Then you can go back and look at it and see if you can understand the topic a little bit better. Now we're going into our first case study, which is McDonald's. And in terms of reference, you can use the movie The Founder. You can use Behind the Arches, which is the McDonald's book, and then you can use Grind It Out, which is as well the background on McDonald's. So those are books. The two books you can use as a reference to understand where McDonald's is coming from and how how did it get to where it is today, where it's a major global player. And then the movie, the founder as well, it gives a very nice background on how Ray built McDonald's from a small shop in San Bernardino to a global giant that McDonald's it is today. So, but we're looking at it specifically on the access to funding eyes, if you can call it that from the access to funding perspective. So now I always start with, before I get into the McDonald's as a brand, I start with the brothers. The McDonald's brothers, before they established McDonald's, they were in movie business, and then they bought a burger stand in Arcadia, and then with funding, they funded the initial business using their own funds. So they didn't go out in to the third party to raise funding. What they did is, after their movie business failed, so they bought the burger stand using their own funds that they had saved from their movie business. And then that's called bootstrapping. It's when an entrepreneur uses their own funds to start a business. And they started the business, and then they had to move it to San Bernardino. And they didn't have money to buy another stand, because then they had to carry that burger stand that they bought on a truck, and then they were struggling to get it there because it couldn't go under the bridge, and they had to cut it in half so that they can get there and re-establish it at San Bernardino. That's the length that an entrepreneur will go to make sure that they make their business successful, because they didn't have the money to set up a new shop in San Bernardino. So they had to take the stand that they had bought in Arcadia. Because sometimes if you have the money, then they would have left the stand or sold it at a loss and went and established a new one in San Bernardino. But because they didn't have the money, because they were bootstrapping their business, they had to make sure that they salvage everything that they can from these existing operations when they moved to San Bernardino. And why did they move? They moved because that stand or the business in Arcadia was not making enough money, because the area apparently was small, so they didn't have enough customers to sustain the business. And what they did then, they moved to San Bernardino because it was a little bit bigger. And they got there using their own funds. They established the restaurant there, and initially it was what they call drive-in. And then where cars comes in, they park there, and the waiters go to them and service them, take the orders, go back into the store, prepare the order, and take it to the person in the car, which is the drive-in mode. They realized that is not working, or it worked for a while, but they realized that they reached peak, and they couldn't generate more income. So what they did is they had to relook at their menu and see if there are any business opportunities for them to increase their revenue. Then they remodeled the whole store, and they got rid of other things that they were selling, and they focused on burger, fries, and chips. And they custom made their kitchen, basically using their own design, where they were making it easier for employees to move around. So they were reducing the steps that employees take when they are making burgers to make it more efficient. And once they built that, then they were operating, they were happy, they were making lots of sales until they met Ray. Okay, they ordered, I think, 7 multi-mixers from Ray, and he was surprised that what kind of a drive-in buys 7 multi-mixers. So he wanted to see it. And when he went there, he was so impressed that he negotiated that, look, let's build more of this, because this is a beautiful operation. You can't just operate it as a one store. So we need to franchise it, and he negotiated until the McDonald's brothers agreed to franchise it. Then he had to establish his first store in Chicago, so that he can have call it an exhibition, or where a showroom of some kind, where he can show people what is he talking about when he's talking about McDonald's. So when in the process, how the question is, because we're looking at how do you access funding. So with Ray, because the brand was not known then, he went to the banks. The banks didn't want to fund him because, I mean, high risk. And generally, it's what as an entrepreneur you will experience. If you have a new concept, like the McDonald's concept at the time, you are unlikely to secure funding because banks and funding institutions, they are risk averse. Okay, which is understandable because your concept is not yet proven. So they can invest in your business and your business fail. So they prefer existing businesses. Not only ours, but ours is even worse. But even the American system is like that. Unless, okay, with the stories that we hear on the tech side, or if it's a tech business, they are willing to invest it because the potential is just crazy. But making burgers and all that, there's so much that you can make from an operation of like cooking food and stuff. So Ray struggled to secure funding, and then he had to bootstrap his first restaurant. So he went to the bank and then took a second mortgage bond on his property. Oh, without his wife knowing. But okay, that's a story for another day. Then he secured the funding using the second bond on his property to build his first store. Okay, that's how he funded his first store. So he bootstrapped his first store. And remember, okay, entrepreneurs, sometimes you might not have access to funding in terms of the third party funding you. You need to look at the resources that you have and start with what you have, like Ray did. Okay, and then he established the first restaurant, and then he started franchising. So, and he set up a small operation. I mean, at the time, he only had June as the secretary or the administrator. And as he was expanding or franchising the store, he was not making money because he was taking, I think, 1.9% cut on turnover. The royalties at the time was about 1.9%. Okay. Then what happened is because he was expanding and training other franchises, he was not making money from that. And then, so the business model at the time was not working. Then he approached, so he struggled basically to fund his own operation. Remember, he took the bond, he funded his first store. But he needed to set up an operation to support other franchisees who he was giving them franchises. So, but he didn't have enough working capital to support those franchisees because the royalties that he was getting from franchisees was not enough. So when you're looking to access funding, make sure that you're not only looking at funding your capital requirements, which are your assets. You also need to take into account that you have to find the working capital, meaning the rent, the printing, the phones, the administrators and all that, and the lease if you are not owning the property that you're operating from. So those things need to be paid. And you can raise maybe commercial funding to fund your capital expenses, which is they call capex, and fund your working capital, the money that you want to use to operate the business. That's working capital funding. They are funding you for those softer things like your rent, your buying stock, paying employees and all that. And most especially for startups, you really need sufficient working capital because sometimes you don't generate enough income from the start. So your operations will start and as people know it and you build reputation, then the revenue will ramp up until you reach your peak. So before you reach your peak, so that means you will be making losses. It's standard. Most, I would say probably 90% of startups, you start by making losses at your initial stage, and then once you reach there will be certain point where you reach what they call break-even point, where your revenue and your expenses are equal. So you're either not making a loss or you're not making profit. And now with your operating cost level and your revenue growing, then once your revenue is above your operating cost, that's when you start making profit. But before you get to that point, you're going to be at the point where you're not making enough revenue to cover your operating cost. You'll be operating at a loss. So when you're starting, you need to make sure that you have sufficient working capital, which in this case, Ray made a mistake of not providing for that when he was raising his funding. So now, to fund the working capital, he tried to renegotiate his terms with the McDonald's brothers to say this 1.9% is not working for us, guys. We need to increase the royalties that we're charging. And the McDonald's brothers, they say, no, we signed the agreement. You agreed to this term, to the terms of the agreement. So you need to stick to the terms. Then he went to the bank to try to raise funding. Then he struggled to raise funding because he didn't own those stores. Because at the time, the model was that he approves the franchisee, and the franchisee must go must find the location and set up the store. And Ray or McDonald's will only provide them with the technical know-how and the training and the supply chain process in terms of sourcing of the raw products that they need to process, like your bun, your potatoes, your drinks. So that they will facilitate from the McDonald's franchisor point of view. The franchisee will just service the customers and then pay that 1.9 royalty to McDonald's. So it was not enough. And Ray, when he realized that he doesn't have sufficient funding, then he started going to the banks to try to raise more, and the banks were telling them no. Because one, your model is not working, because you say you have few stores that you are running, but where are the assets? You don't own the stores that you say you are running, because the franchisees are the ones who are owning the store. So it put him in a very difficult position until he met Harrison Ebon. Then Harrison Ebon, he was surprised that Ray is not making money. So he went and looked at the books. He realized that no, you're not going to make money by charging 1.9% on a 15-cent burger. So that was not a sustainable business model. And now Harry suggested that Ray must convert now McDonald's, the model, into a real estate model where it will be McDonald's that goes out and buy piece of land, develop it, find the franchisee, put them in the store, provide them with the training, provide them with the brand, provide them with supply chain support. And what the franchisee will do, will have to pay rental to McDonald's and pay royalty fees to McDonald's. So that was more a sustainable model. But the most important part is, because Ray was expanding, he needed capital. So changing from a pure franchise model where SMMEs or franchisees were building their own store, then he moved to the model of McDonald's building buying the piece of land and developing those pieces of land into their store. So that now opened interest from external funders and equity funders to fund McDonald's, because you couldn't access that market. You couldn't access that funding because the model was not working and the banks didn't have security. So now with this model that he buys pieces of land and then he develops them. Then he uses those properties as security. Because remember, banks, they look for security. Yes, you can show them how perfect your business is and how profitable it could be. But the question is, where's the security? So if they don't have security, they won't fund you. So now with Ray, then with the new model, it allowed them to be able to access sufficient funding for them to expand. Because now the commercial funders, they've seen that there is funding, there is security, and the business is growing. So it made it easier for external funders or commercial funders to fund McDonald's. And now, based on that model that was suggested by Harry Sonneborn, then McDonald's grew to what it is because it can easily access funding because now it had property behind it. And that's how it became one of the biggest real estate businesses in the world, because it was buying property and developing it and putting the franchises in there. That's what allowed them to expand, because you need access to funding for you to expand your business. And sometimes bootstrapping might not help you. We saw the brothers bootstrapped from a burger stand to building their first McDonald's. Ray had to bootstrap to build his own McDonald's. And then he struggled until Harry came with the model of creating a real estate component. And then that real estate is the one that allowed them to access sufficient funding to expand the business. Oh, and then when Ray was expanding the business, then he had differences with the McDonald's brothers. So he had to pay them 1.2 million for them to exit the McDonald's brand. So McDonald's as it is, the brothers didn't benefit much because once Ray accessed the funding, then he bought them out. 1.2, and then they were out of the McDonald's brand, and Ray continued to expand McDonald's to what it is today. So the McDonald's brothers didn't really benefit much. I mean, they made only $1.2 million. But at the time, in the 50s, it was a lot of money. But they could have been wealthy if they stayed or they maintained their relationship with Ray, and it grew with them being part of the shareholding. But they were no longer shareholders because Ray managed to access funding that replaced them, and that funding he used it to expand. So that's the lesson that you can learn from access to funding from this McDonald's story, that sometimes you need to bootstrap, fund your business on your own, and then once the business reaches a certain stage, then it makes it easier for external funders to fund it. Now we've looked at how McDonald's was funded. First it was bootstrapping, and then Ray managed to secure commercial funding that he used to expand the brand to what it is today. Now we're going to look at AY, which is our second case study. This is from the movie War Dogs, and it's based on true story. That's okay. Obviously, it's a movie, so they will exaggerate it at certain points. But the gist of it is, these were 20-something-year-old two gentlemen who went into tenderpreneurship, meaning they were bidding for tenders, and with them they focused only on one department, the Department of Defense, and they focus on that market mainly because it was during the Bush administration. So at the time, it was just after the Iraq war, where US, I don't know if it was a war or what, but where the US invaded Iraq. During that time, the US made a mistake of only procuring from big suppliers, mainly the Chinese suppliers. So it was a mistake, and Bush received some backslash from the country to say he used the money to buy arms from Chinese instead of boosting the local economy and all those political complaints. So when they went to Iraq, No, when they went to Afghanistan, so they established a portal where they will advertise all contracts that Pentagon wanted to of all the tenders, not contract, all the tenders. So that whoever that wants to bid, everyone, wonke umuntu, was willing or was able to bid for those contracts. And in this case, Ephraim saw an opportunity there to service that market but he was not competing with the big contractors. He focused on the small tenders, because in his way he said, look, those tenders, okay, they look like crumbs because defense spent quite a bit on equipping soldiers. So, but the big suppliers are ignoring those small contracts because to them it's not much. But for a small business, those crumbs becomes a lot. So Ephraim focused on those crumbs. That was his business model. All right. But before we go into details in terms of how Ephraim funded AUI to tender for those defense contracts, let's go back a little bit, because his partner was David. David was selling bed sheets, which he bootstrapped. Okay, he started by massaging people, old people, and then as he was massaging people, then he made profit. So what is called retained earnings, and then he used the retained earnings to enter into the bed sheet business, where he's buying bed sheets and to sell them to retirement homes or old age homes. So now that is bootstrapping, because I'm just trying to make sure that we link the movie or the case study to the topic that we're talking about today. So that is called bootstrapping. It's when you use the profits that you are generating, you are reinvesting them into your business without going out looking for grants or for angel investors or looking for commercial funding. You as you operate, as you generate profit, you don't go party and do whatever and misuse it. You save it and you reinvest it in the business. That's one method or one way of bootstrapping your business, so that you don't load a lot of debt on your business. Because remember, if you go borrow money, debt becomes a burden to your business. So in the case of David, he did that. He started a smaller business of massaging rich people in the area, and then from that profit, then he bought sheets in bulk so that he can sell it to old age homes. So now, if you look at it, okay, he was on the right path in terms of the approach, because generally as academians and people in the training space will normally tell entrepreneurs about creating a minimum viable product, meaning when you start, because you're going to struggle to access big funds, you need to start with small funds that you have, so that you build the business to a certain point that external funders will be willing to fund you to grow your business. So it's very, very important in terms of learning from how David approached his business. Okay, he made a mistake by buying those bed sheets, because his target market was the old age homes, and people, as he said, people didn't care about old age homes if they have the best sheets ever. So now that market was not willing to buy the bed sheets that he bought. He bought high quality bed sheets, and as he was trying to sell that to the old age homes, they were not interested. To say, we're not interested in that. We're just buying the basic sheets that we can get, the cheapest sheets available. So he didn't have the market for to sell his expensive bed sheets. That's where he was, and lucky enough, at this point, his business now was doomed, because he was not making money. He had bought them in bulk. He can't return them to the suppliers. Then that's where he met Ephraim, who I gave you a little bit background in terms of him being in the defense space. So with him and Ephraim, they started, okay, not started, but he joined Ephraim in AEY and they started expanding. Meaning, what they did is they focused on the defense contract. So they'll go on that portal. They call it what, Biz Hub, something Biz Hub, which is the website where they only advertise the defense contracts or the defense tenders. So it was like in South African context, like e-tender. The tendering system that government use, I think they call it e-tender. So you can go there and search for tenders there. So, but this one was designed specifically for the defense contracts, defense tenders. Then they went there and they searched for contracts. So if they found a contract that they can bid for, then they will prepare documents. But how did they fund? Now they secured few contracts because they had the Iraq deal where they were supposed to supply the Beretus, whatever the type of guns that they were supposed to supply to Iraq, to the American soldiers. It was a big contract, like I think 300,000 or something like that. Then what they do, if they get a contract, then they approach the guy called Ralph. Ralph, he was a local businessman who had money. Then Ralph will invest in that business for a profit share. So you'll take 30% of a profit cut from what AEY will make, or what Ephraim and David will make. So it takes 30% of the profit. So now that's the type of funding that AEY used, which in this case we can call it an angel investor. So angel investor is individuals who are investing in small businesses with potential. So with Ephraim, he was not a formal institution. He was not a formal investor. So what you'll do is, because Ephraim approached him, but but he misled him to say he's buying guns to protect Israel because he was Jewish. Okay, they're both Jewish. So now he approached him to say, I'm going into a business, I'm buying and selling guns, but mainly to protect Israel. So he convinced Ralph to invest in his business, to say, okay, it's for a good cause to protect Israel, because both of them were Jewish. So that's how you get angel investors. So you need to pitch your business ideas to angel investors, and now they will decide if they invest in your business, and you negotiate the terms of that deal. They might take 30%, they might take 40% of your business, and then you work together. And the nice thing about angel investing is that generally those people are successful business people. So if you get money from them, they will want to protect their investment. So they are likely to give you a mentorship. You are likely to learn from them. And because it's more on profit share, it's not like a loan, a commercial loan, where you need to repay a certain amount every month. It doesn't strain your business because it allows it to grow. But obviously the chunk that they're going to get when they're getting their dividends is very high. And to a certain extent, you lose control of the business because you need to give them shareholding most of the time, because they also want to say, we are taking risk in your business, but we need to also get the benefits, which makes sense. I mean, it's a generally acceptable principle to say risk returns. And remember, at the time, most of the time, if you go to angel investors, it's unlikely that you would have secured the commercial funding. Look, if you have security and you have maybe a good credit record and you are maintaining your business, you can approach a funding institution. It's cheaper, but for a startup, it might not be an appropriate funding instrument, because what happens is you need to pay interest every month. And if you are at a growing stage, remember, as I said, that sometimes, most of the time, the startups, initially you are making losses, right? as your profit grow, you find that your fixed operating expenses are here, and you start here. Obviously, you're going to have few customers, but as you grow, you'll get to a point where at this point, your revenue will be below your cost, so you'll be making losses. And if you are making losses, if you have a loan that you need to repay and you are making losses, that can put a lot of strain on your business. And then, but it will get better when you are already now operating above your costs, because your costs are more or less fixed. And then as your revenue grow, it will get to a point where you are at a break-even point, and then after break-even point, then you are starting to make profit. And if you are making profit, then a commercial funding makes sense, because you have the profit to pay, to be able to pay the funding. And secondly, the commercial funding, generally, they give you funding cheaper. So it means they give you funding at lower interest rate compared to what the angel investors will charge you. Yes, angel investors, they're not charging you interest most of the time. They're just taking equity and they'll get dividends. But the internal rate of return that they are looking at is very high. We're talking maybe in the high 20s for the business to make sense, because they're taking high risk. They don't have security. They don't have consistent income. And most of the time, when you're looking for angel investors, it's when your business doesn't have proven record. So they're taking a serious risk. And then that's why it makes sense for them to want equity in your business. While for commercial funders, most of the time they're not interested in taking equity in your business. So with AUI, Ephraim had to take the angel investing route, because there was no, probably could have maybe found funding, but it would have been difficult for any institution to fund him. And in South Africa, we have a lot of businesses that they say, if you secure their tender, they will fund you. So sometimes it becomes a mismatch where you have to get a tender first and then apply for funding. And the application process, some they claim it takes you a day, 3 days, but to sign the legal agreements and all that, and until you receive the money, let's say it's 10 days for that process to complete, because they still need to take sessions and all those things. So they will misrepresent to say, within 2 days you are approved. Yes, you can be approved, but there is still a long process before you get your money. So you might think, no, I'll secure the tender and approach the funding institution for funding, because I would have already secured the market. But that doesn't always work, because now once they give you a tender, you need to get to work. Now you are still running around trying to secure funding, and that can compromise your project. So it's always better, if you are in that space, to have an angel investor available, or get funded by angel investor like Ephraim or AUI was funded, so that when you secure a tender, you're not worried about the funding. You know that you go into execution immediately, rather than once you secure the tender, then you're still running around trying to secure funding. You might end up even losing the tender. So from the AUI story, you need to learn that, or understand that there are different types of funding. And in case of AUI, they funded their business using angel investing. And key thing that you need to understand, angel investing, the return they're looking for it's high, and most of the time they take shareholding in your business. So that's how the angel investing works. And I guess in terms of the lesson from here, remember, the relationship between Ralph and Ephraim was not an honest one, because actually the angel investor was not getting the 30% that he thought he was getting, because Ephraim on the other side was cooking the books. So the dividends that Ephraim was supposed to pay Ralph for his investment was supposed to be 30%. But I think towards the end, David mentioned that they were paying about 15%, not what they agreed on. But that's a different story. The main thing here, the relevant point, is that AUI funded their business using angel investing. Which is an option that an entrepreneur can also follow. Now we have looked at how McDonald's was funded. We looked at how AUI was funded, and then now we come into the Oakland A's. How did Billy fund his operations or buying players? But as a way of background, the Oakland A was a small baseball team, and they didn't have big budgets, so they were competing in a league with the Yankees and the other Red Sox, the other big baseball teams. So once there's a promising player in the Oakland A's, then the big teams will buy them, and they have to go back to the drawing board to try and find replacements. And generally, they wouldn't find the replacement at the quality of the players that the big players have bought. Like it's a normal scenario where in sports, not only baseball, in sports in general, where big teams will buy all good players from the small teams, and that cripples the small teams. It's like in South Africa, what Sundowns will do to small teams. If there's a promising player, they go buy that promising player, and what it does, it cripples the other small teams, and those teams cannot compete with it because it will have all the best players. They will have all their best players in the squad. So it's the same thing. The Oakland A's found themselves as a small team, and the big teams will scavenge on it. Once it discovers good players, then the big teams will come and buy those players. So that was the challenge that Billy was facing, right? And on the other side, Billy didn't have access to funding. So Steve, who was the team owner, he indicated that, I know you lost the players, but I don't have money to give you to go reinvest in the team. All you have to do is go back to the drawing board, look at players that are available in the market and buy the players that we can afford, because we don't have money to put in. So in this case, the shareholder was not willing to put in equity investment in the business, and he was not willing to go outside to secure or to apply for commercial funding. Remember, the Oakland A's was an existing team, so it could have easily went out to apply for commercial funding. I believe they have a proven record. I mean, they were in the league for a long time, so they could have used commercial funding, but the owner didn't want to put debt on the team, and two, he was not willing to put another equity into to fund the business. So now Billy had to be creative, right? So what Billy did, he met Peter Brand. He called him Pete. So he met Pete, and Pete was an economics graduate from what, Stanford? Oh, okay, whatever, one of the big universities in the US. And then Pete understood maths, that there's a guy called Bill James who developed a calculation or a system that can calculate a player. How much is the value of a player? And then that system was ignoring all the other things, the where you discriminate players maybe based on color, height, weight, age, and all those things. So it was a pure maths system that can show you undervalued players in the league. Okay, so what happened is then Billy hired Pete to be his assistant. And what Pete did, he said, look, we don't have access to funding, right? And how they approached it is that they will bootstrap the business, meaning they will fund it using their existing income or using their using their retained earnings. So now, if you are funding it or you are bootstrapping the business, generally it makes you think harder on spending money. So you wouldn't spend money on things that you're not supposed to spend money on because you know you don't have enough funding. That's one positive thing about when businesses are bootstrapping their operations. So even with Billy at the Oakland A, he had to find an innovative way to buy players. And now, because he was open and trying to come up with solutions, that's where he met Peter Brand. And Peter Brand implemented that system where they can find players that other teams are ignoring. And they were very cheap. So they didn't have access to new funding. They didn't have access to funding. They struggled to access funding, which is the story of almost all startups or all small businesses. Access to funding is a problem. Similarly, the Oakland A's didn't have access to funding. So what they had to do is to fund the operation using the resources that they had. And how they did it is using the Peter Brand's approach, using that maths that Bill James has developed. So what they did is, instead of trying to push and knock at doors to get funding and maybe keep on pestering Steve, the owner, they left Steve and they focused on trying to find the cheapest players possible in the league using that system of theirs. So now, access to funding didn't stop them. They didn't stop the business. They didn't abandon their strategy or whatever. But it made them innovative to find different ways to operate the business or to efficiently operate the business. Sometimes with entrepreneurs, they use access to funding as an excuse why they are not going into business or why they stopped pursuing their dreams or pursuing a business idea. They'll say, because I can't access funding. Now, here's the story of Billy, who couldn't access funding. He didn't give up, didn't resign, he didn't leave. He found an innovative way to continue operating, one. But the fact that he didn't have access to funding, it made him to be more creative, where he managed to win. I mean, they won about 20 games straight without losing, they broke the record. I don't know how many years. I think it was 100-year-old. Whatever the years, it was a very long record. It was the first time a team goes 20 games without losing since the baseball sports has been established in the USA. So they broke all the records. And they broke all those records with the challenge of them not being able to access funding or competing with the teams that had a lot of money, who were buying all the best players. I mean, that season that they went 20 games without losing is the same year. The previous year, they had lost their top three players because the Yankees bought them. So they put together a cheap squad and they went on to break the American record. So you don't necessarily need funding to be successful. You don't necessarily need access to funding to run a profitable business. Sometimes you just need innovation. You need sometimes have the mentality of working with what you have for you to build a business, which is what Billy did. And at the end of the day, yes, they lost in the finals and they lost to the Yankees, I think. Yeah, they lost to the Yankees. But the main thing is, when they analyzed the cost that the teams have spent, Billy had spent, I think, $230,000 US and per win. So they won the same number in that season. They won the same number of games as the Yankees right? But the Yankees spend 1.2 million per game, per win. And then Billy spent about 234 or 230, whatever the amount. But it's comparing 1.2 million to 230 something or 200,000. And this team still won the same number of games as the team that spent 1.2 million. You can see that it's not always about access to funding. It's about innovation. It's about doing the things that you can with the limited budget that you have. You can be a Billy Bean, change your industry by being innovative. If maybe you ignore the fact that, or you accept the fact that you can't access the funding, then that will allow you, because during even their strategy session, Billy indicated that, guys, you need to accept that we don't have the funding. We don't have the money. So what we need to do is to be creative, is to us to come with different methods or different strategies for us to be able to compete. Because we can't compete pounds to pounds or a rand to rand with, or a dollar to dollar with the Yankees, because they have the budget we don't have. So they needed to be innovative to be competitive. So now the lesson here is that as an entrepreneur, one, bootstrapping, you can see from the McDonald's story, there is a level of bootstrapping. To AY, not much, because they had Ralph, but obviously they operated from offices which they funded, but it was not a major bootstrapping. It's just for offices, which applies to all tenderpreneurs. Remember, if you are a tenderpreneur, you just need an office. You just need an office, maybe a line, a fax, whatever, a fax, a printer, so that you can print your documents and whatever. And you are ready to go. It doesn't need a significant investment. So AY bootstrapped their operations, even though they had Ralph as an angel investor. When they secure the contracts, Ralph will fund them for those contracts. And then you have Billy from the Oakland A's, who bootstrapped the business, but he used the retained earnings. So as he buys players and sell players, then there will be a profit that's retained to run the club. So he used that, and he was successful in that, because he won the same number of games as the Yankees, but they spent 1.2 while he spent 200,000. So that's the difference between real entrepreneurs and other entrepreneurs. Because with other entrepreneurs, you find that they're looking for excuses why they can't access funding. Yes, access to funding, it is a challenge. It's not even only a South African challenge, it's a global challenge. But in South Africa, it's worse, because there's previous inequalities, and the system is more favoring people with security, proven business track record and all that. And the challenge is that majority of South Africans, they don't have a proven business record, they don't have security, and they don't even have property, because if you look at Ray, he used his own property. But if you stay in the rural area, you don't even have a title deed to your property. So you can't even use the title deed to secure funding, because they can't take it as security. So commercial funding, it might be a challenge. Yes, grant funding, we're just too many. It will cover some, it won't cover others. So it becomes a challenge. Angel investing, yes, most of maybe businesses, maybe in the rural areas and all that, not that they can't do tech business. So angel investing is more on high growth businesses rather than the businesses that are lifestyle businesses or just sustainable businesses. So most businesses will not even qualify to secure or to access angel investing funding. But that being said, and based on the Billy Bean story from the Oakland A's, it shows that you can be creative in accessing funding. You don't necessarily have to look at commercial funding. You can find maybe an innovative way to execute your project while you're using limited funds. And the thread from all the three movies, I'll repeat, all of them, they used bootstrapping. If you look at the McDonald's brothers, when they started the McDonald's store, they bootstrapped. Ray Kroc, when he built his first store, he bootstrapped. David, when he was doing his bedsheet business, bootstrapped. Ephraim, when he set up, he bootstrapped. And okay, the angel investor came a little bit later, but initially he bootstrapped. And then Billy Bean at Oakland A, he bootstrapped. He used the internal funds rather than obtaining external funding. So you can see the thread from these case studies. Bootstrapping is critical for entrepreneurs. So you need to bootstrap to up to a certain point where investors can have confidence in your business. Yeah, that's in business, they can fund you while you are a startup, but startup funding is difficult to get, if not impossible. So where you can, bootstrap as much as you can so that you are able to prove the concept and you are able to show potential investors that this business is sustainable. That's the approach that I will personally recommend that entrepreneurs must take. But you have options. You can apply for grants, you can apply for commercial funding, you can look for angel investing, you can crowdfunding. There are different sources of funding, but the best funding, if you are a startup or a micro business, is to bootstrap your business to a certain point. So that's it on our lesson on the case studies on access to funding, and I hope that there are lessons that you gained from these case studies and you will be able to implement them in your business.